Today's video has nothing to do with costumes or cosplay. I saw a really cool joke gift box that you could get at Target. That was at my first campfire, and I thought that would be really cute to make for one of our friends' kids. If you're interested in that, keep on watching. I found these fabric quarters on sale at Joann's, and they were the perfect fabric to use for this project. Here's a rough sketch of the shape and dimensions that I wanted. Then using that sketch, I then made a full-size pattern with the dimensions that I wanted. I ended up using the same piece of paper for all 3 pieces of the flame because that made it a lot easier. I just drew each one inside and then, as you'll see in a minute, cut each piece out individually. Because the fabric was folded, I then ironed each piece out. For the flame, I needed 2 pieces per pattern. Since this fabric was double-sided, I could just fold it over without paying attention to which side. So I folded this in half, pinned the pattern on, and then cut out the 2 pieces. I also cut out a lining fabric with this pattern. I forgot to show it, but you do see me do it for the other 2 flame parts. This fabric is not double-sided, so I pinned it right sides together and then traced the outline of the flame shape twice onto this. And then sewed along the line, leaving a gap at the bottom for me to be able to flip this piece inside out. I did this for both pieces. Next, I cut both pieces out. When doing so, I also cut notches into the hem of each piece so then when it was flipped inside out, the hem wouldn't bunch up as much. Try to make a hole that's not too big that it's annoying to sew up later, but not too small that you can't get the flame flipped inside out. I then repeated the same process for the orange part of the flame. Again, this is not 2-sided fabric, so I did right sides together and then traced out the pieces, sewed them up leaving a gap, and then cut and then flipped them inside out. After flipping them right side out, I used a knitting needle and an iron to iron all of the pieces flat and make sure that all of the edges were nice and crisp and not showing incorrectly. Then I laid out the pieces just to see how they were going to look. I pinned the yellow piece onto the orange piece and sewed right around the edge of the yellow piece. In the process, I also sewed up that gap shut from when I flipped it inside out. And then did the same thing with the orange piece onto the red piece, sewed around the hem, and sewed up the gap. After doing this with both sides of the flame, I then put the right sides together along with the lining fabric on the outsides to sew the pieces together. For this piece, it's a lot more important to have a slightly larger gap because the fabric's a lot thicker, so I actually had to seam rip before being able to flip the piece inside out. Next, I used polyfill and my knitting needle along with other random skinny tools to stuff the flame, making sure to get as much, get it as packed into the tips as I could. I'll link below to a tutorial on how to do a ladder stitch, which is what I used, but apparently forgot to film. Moving on to the logs, these are a lot easier because they're just rectangles, so I put the fabric right sides together along with that lining fabric, pinned it, and cut the pieces out. I'm going to put a link below to a tutorial I followed by Birdcage and Thread about figuring out how to make a cylinder using pie and making the right circle for the size of the rectangle that you have. So here I am doing that math, creating the pattern to cut out the circle. For the ends of the logs, I'm going to be doing 2 pieces, so I have the lining fabric and the outer fabric folded over, pinning, and then cutting those pieces out. Next, you're going to fold over to create that tube, pin that together, and sew down. The
next steps are way better explained in that birdcage and thread tutorial I mentioned, but pretty much you have to cut slits to be able to fold the fabric outwards and then pin the cap fabric on, making sure to do the insides, the right sides to the inside. It's kind of complicated. It took me a couple tries, but definitely watch that tutorial if you want to know how to do this better than I did. Now you're going to sew that seam shut. Since we're going to be flipping this inside out, one end is totally fine to sew completely shut, but when you do the other end of the log, you're going to make sure to leave a gap so you can flip everything inside out and also stuff. This is on the second end, and you can see that I left a small gap there to be able to flip this inside out, which I'm now going to do. Now again, using polyfill, I'm going to go ahead and stuff that as tightly as I can using random tools, again, knitting needles. I've used sewing scissors, pretty much whatever you have laying around to pack it in as tight as you can. Again, you almost want to overstuff this guy. So next I did a really bad job of filming myself doing the ladder stitch to sew up that seam. I'll link a couple of the videos I followed below. It's a pretty basic stitch and it's used a lot to close up those small holes. And there you have it. So you're going to go ahead and do that as many times as you want. I made 3 logs with different fabric just to spice it up a little bit. And we have a campfire.
Overall, I think that this went pretty well. The logs were very easy and were a nice little break from the insanity of making the flames. The flame itself, I would do differently next time, only because the actual flame tips ended up being a little bit smaller than I would have liked in the stuffed part, because I kind of forgot to account for the stuffing width, and I was thinking it would more be sitting flat. So if I were to do it again, I would add a little more space there. But overall, I think it turned out pretty cute for a little 2-year-old.